everybody. We've got a really great group today. Oh my gosh, I'm seeing some old friends in the audience. This is really exciting. Good morning and welcome to all of our docents. I hope you had a wonderful meeting this morning. And I want to welcome all of our special MESC visitors taking part in our partner program, Inclusion and Collaboration from the Inside. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emily Mahon, and I serve the Bowers Museum and our community as Senior Director of Education. But before I pass along the talking stick to our special guests, I'm going to attempt to quickly and thoroughly give us a little bit of a context and set the scene for today's event. Just so that we know why we're here and what we're here to do, so that our docents and all of our guests are all on the same page moving forward. Beginning in March of 2017 through the 2018 fiscal year, the Education Department at the Bowers Museum and members of the Docent Guild Board began a phase one of a three-phase project that we titled the Education Docent Integration Project. This project was developed with the intent to create a deeper collaborative relationship between the Docent Guild, which is a volunteer affiliate group of the museum, and the Education Department towards the use of a consistent institutional voice and shared understanding of policy and procedures in docent training, evaluation, and tour implementation. In phase one, the Docent Guild and the Education Department embarked on a year-long collaborative process, which included lots of lunches at our Tangata restaurant here, where we defined together various avenues of change that needed to be addressed in order to achieve an overarching environment of collaboration in support of the Bowers Museum's mission. We are now this year instituting phase two, which we have titled Gallery Tour Development, with a goal to present a clear communication of policies, procedures, and roles for the development and implementation of gallery tours. Phase two, we hope, will enable the Docent Guild and the Education Department to work together more effectively and efficiently to deliver strong visitor experiences that reflect the needs of the Bowers Museum's current and future audiences. As we work together to make these goals evident at the Bowers Museum, we are reminded that we do not work in a vacuum. Rather, we are part of a large network of cultural institutions and museums locally and regionally and nationally who also have docent programs and education teams and have found avenues to move forward collaboratively and affect positive change in service of their particular missions and audiences. MESC, Museum Educators of Southern California, is one of the oldest and largest museum education professional organizations in the country, providing Southern California museum educators with professional development, theoretical discourse, practical training, and networking for over 40 years. Having had the pleasure of serving on the board of the Museum of Educators Southern California in the past, I was immediately driven to reach out to Rebecca Harding, MESC's current president, and pitch her my idea to better understand where the Bowers fits in the larger picture. And I'm extremely excited to host representatives from institutions such as the Natural History Museum, the Reagan Library, and LACMA here at the Bowers Museum to learn from and to engage each other in conversation around how we all approach and manage what is absolutely core to every museum's education department, their team of gallery educators. Whether in the form of paid staff educators, volunteer docents, visitor service representatives, or a combination of these three, these key members of the museum community often serve as visitors' first impression and are also most likely responsible for the lasting impression of many visitors' overall museum experiences. So today, we explore best practices in training and evaluation of docents and educators, particularly in response to the responsibility of museums in the 21st century to provide visitors access to inclusive, respectful, and culturally relevant interpretive experiences of their collections and spaces. It is in this spirit that I introduce to you Associate Director of Learning and Engagement at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute and the President of MESC, Rebecca Harding.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. We were so excited when Emily reached out to us. Brief introduction. By day, I am Rebecca Harding, Associate Director of Learning and Engagement at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Our foundation actually operates out of the Presidential Library site out in Simi Valley, so I had a little bit of a drive this morning coming out, but it was beautiful. And then by night, in my off time, I am also the president of the Museum Educators of Southern California. And as Emily already stated, we are one of the oldest professional development networks for museum education in the country. And I just kind of wanted to read you our mission because I think it really aligns for the reason why we're here today. We are an inclusive alliance of critically aware museum educators who cultivate and build strategic relationships rooted in sharing resources and encouraging experimentation that empowers the field. And that's really what we're here today. We are inclusive in the different staffing structures that we have at 3 different institutions, and we're going to be sharing resources that are rooted in developing relationships that kind of move our field forward. And so we're really excited that Emily reached out to us so that we could be here for that today. To kind of ground our conversation, I wanted to start off with just some language. When Emily and I and our panel were thinking about what we wanted to frame the conversation and come up with this lovely title. Sometimes titles can just be buzzwords that you throw in together to make it sound nice for people to show up to a program. That's not the case for this one. We really wanted to be intentional with what the program was looking at. And so we used this word inclusion. And so I was looking for some common definitions of what that means and how we can kind of apply it to our work. And the American Alliance of Museums over the past year has been doing a lot of work in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And in May, they published their definition. And so I think that we can use that to ground us today so we all kind of understand what we're talking about in inclusion. And I believe it's really beautiful. So inclusion refers to the intentional, ongoing effort that ensure that diverse individuals fully participate in all aspects of organizational work, including decision-making processes. It also refers to the ways that diverse participants are valued as respected members of an organization and/or a community. While a truly inclusive group is necessarily diverse, a diverse group may not always be inclusive. And the reason why I really like that definition is because it empowers all of us in that room. Within museums, all of our work should be valued. All of our work should be taken into consideration with decision-making processes. And I know that on today's conversation, that's where a lot of this comes into play, is building those relationships, ensuring that voices are all at the table as we move forward towards a shared goal. So I'm really excited about our panel that we've put here together today. I wanted to start it off with a quote of a really wonderful, nationally known museum educator, Monica Montgomery. If you're not familiar with her work, I encourage you to look her up on the internet and look at some of her TED Talks. But Monica says that museum education has the power and responsibility to do the challenging inner work of tackling tough topics and turning them into teachable moments. Now, this might be something that we can apply externally to our audiences, but for today's conversation, I want to kind of turn it inwards into our own relationships. Looking at paid staff structures and volunteer docent structures and how they integrate and serve the same mission and institution is really challenging. And there's not a one-size-fits-all model, which we'll see today across our panel. And sometimes discussing that of what works, what doesn't, and how we move forward together, that's really tough work. But in doing so, we tackle it, we come through it together inclusively, and then we turn them into really beautiful, teachable learning moments. And so that's really what I hope today does, is that we move forward this conversation for the field to learn from one another. Every single one of our panel participants is really excited to actually learn from the audience, as well as learn from each other. So I think it's going to be a beautiful conversation. And with that being said, I would like to invite all of our panelists up to the stage. This is going to be more of a format of a casual conversation. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes having them introduce themselves and their institution and what those structures and the scope of their work looks like. And then we're going to move into a guided conversation. And then we're going to open it up to the floor, and we encourage questions because we would love to have a dialogue with the audience as well and tap into the resources that we know are right in front of us.
My name is Kristen Bankston. I'm the Director of Gallery Learning at LACMA, and I'm here with Ellen Kaplan, who, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Ellen Kaplan. I'm a docent at LACMA. Last year I was the chair of the council, and I've been a docent for almost 15 years, and I'm a former museum educator.
We're just
want us
working
to
out the
do-
microphones.
We're just going to go down the
Just
line.
the names for now. Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Wiley, and I am Senior Manager of Volunteer Programs for the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. Our family of museums includes the La Brea Tar Pits and Museum, as well as the William S. Hart Museum out in Newhall. And my oversight of the volunteer programs includes the La Brea Tar Pits as well, and get to work very closely with all of our hundreds of amazing volunteers and docents who give their personal time to help our guests connect with the museum's content. So I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you. You got one.
Hi, my name is Colleen Hill. I am the manager of school programs at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and from now on I'm just going to be calling it the Reagan because that is a mouthful. And I really appreciate being here because I don't get out much, so thank you for having me.
Hello, everybody.
Done.
Oh, thank you. Hello. It works. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Fonda Hirsch. I'm a docent at the Reagan Museum, and I'm also chair of the Education and Training Committee. Also, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm so excited to be able to learn from everybody in the audience and our panelists.
No? Okay. Ooh, there we go. I'm going to leave it out here. I've got my strong teacher voice, so microphones and I are not friends. So the reason why we have these three institutions on stage is there are some similarities, but also some differences in regards to the scope of their work, their staffing structures within their education department, and then also what their docent councils or docent guilds look like. There's also different governing bodies. And so to make just a quick clarification, because I am fully rooted in this at the Reagan Foundation operates at the Reagan Library, which is actually a government site that is overseen by the National Archives Records Administration, formerly known, or what we will call from now on, NARA. But I want to just make that explicitly clear that when we're talking about the interactions at the Reagan, there are two governing bodies that are completely separate, and we'll refer to them as Reagan for Reagan Foundation and NARA for the government side. Is that good? Okay, so what I've asked each of our panelists to do is just to give you a brief overview of kind of their work. So we're going to go down the line. They'll be able to introduce kind of the mission of their institution, the scope of their education work and what that staffing structure looks like, and then the docent history as well.
Take this, I need this, yes. Thank you, Rebecca. And again, I just like to echo what everyone's been saying. We're really excited, Ellen and I, to be here, to learn from all of you, and to share what we do. So let's jump into that. LACMA, how many people have been to LACMA? Yeah, all right. Wonderful. So you're familiar with LACMA. We're an encyclopedic art museum, so we have art from around the world. If you tally it all up, it's 6,000 years of art history, 135,000 objects, so we're a good-sized museum. We serve about 1.5 million visitors a year. So the education department at LACMA plays a key role in fulfilling our mission, so I wanted to share our mission with you. Our mission is pretty long and wordy, but it covers a lot of things, so I'm just going to read it to you and then highlight how education fulfills this mission. So the mission of LACMA is to serve the public through the collection, conservation, exhibition, and interpretation of significant works of art from a broad range of cultures and historical periods, and through the translation of these collections into meaningful educational, aesthetic, intellectual, and cultural experiences for the widest array of audiences. So as I said, quite a mouthful, but the key part that education plays in that role is with the interpretation and with the translation of these collections into meaningful educational experiences for the widest array of audiences. So in education, we're really thinking about how to reach as many people as possible to spread this mission. And then when planning our programs and our tours, we have 4 key values that you can see on the screen here that we are thinking about when we're doing these programs. The first is that we're accessible. What we mean by that is that we create a welcoming environment. We want to make sure people feel like they can approach someone who's giving a tour, and that that docent or educator is very inclusive in their teaching. The second is that we're collection focused. We're an art museum. We always want to bring our tour and our program back to the work of art that we're highlighting. The third is that we're visitor-centered. As educators and docents, we're really curious and excited to learn about how people learn, why they come to the museum, what their motivation is, and we recognize that there's multiple ways people learn. So on our tours, for example, of school groups, we're looking to incorporate activities that connect with those different learning styles through drawing, through taking the pose of a sculpture, and things like that. And then the last one is really ambitious, but I love it. It's called, we want them to be transformative. And what do we mean by that? When all these different things are working really well together, we believe that visitors can have meaningful connections with works of art and really walk away with an enlightening experience. So it's a really lofty goal, but I think it's one that gets to kind of the heart of what we do in our teaching and programming. And then in terms of structure, I know this is a little low on the screen, if you can all see it, but the education department is divided into audience areas. So we have one audience area that is school and teacher programs, one that is youth and family programs, and the third one that is public programs. And when we say public programs, we mean programs for adult visitors. And I should also mention in terms of structure, so we have 21 paid staff in the education department, and of those 21, 3 are dedicated to working with the docents. The first is the Senior Vice President of Education and Public Programs. The Docents Council reports to her. She meets with them regularly with the Executive Committee. And then we have myself. I focus on training and evaluation, working really closely with the Docent Council. And then the Docent Council coordinator, Emily Craig, who's also here today with us, who oversees the day-to-day operations. She's the one who's booking the tours with the teachers. She's also really supporting the docents in getting materials so they can prepare to tour. So that's how we approach our structure at LACMA. And then lastly, I just wanted to share a little bit about the history of the Docent Council. I find it really fascinating, LACMA's Docent Council history, and I'm going to turn it over to Ellen in just a moment to share her perspectives as well on that, because she's been with our council since 2004, right? So a long time. And the council started in 1962. Now, LACMA actually officially started at our current location in 1965. So this means they actually started before the education department started, when LACMA was actually part of the Natural History Museum, in which it was the history, science, and art that it covered. So in 1965, we spun off the art part, opened a new building, and the Docent Council came with us, with the art. So they have a really long history. They were a very independent council because they started before the education department did. And I should just mention a little bit about their structure. So it's a 35-member board, and I've listed some of the key board positions on there. Chair, past chair, you can see we have a school programs chair, public programs chair, and a couple others. They started out at the Natural History Museum as a group of 50 volunteers and grew to today to 418, so really big size. Now, interesting, among that number, less than half are actively touring, and the majority of them, as you can see with the stats on the screen, give our school tours, which are our single-visit school tours that range from 60 to 90 minutes. And then the rest give our public tours for adults, and then Ellen is one of our 8 who goes back and forth and does both. And then one other thing that's interesting to know about our Docent Council is in the early 2000s, we embarked on a really big goal to integrate the Docent Council more into the education department. And this was a really collaborative, long-term, slow process. There was a lot of things that were happening in the development of museum education. We were learning a lot more about how people learn and why they come to the museums and what really good touring looks like. And we realized docents and educators are doing the same work in the galleries, so we should be more connected. So I'm going to hand it over to Ellen to kind of share her perspective, because she was there through this, and still is, through this big change. So.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I came to, I am too loud, fine, whatever.
You're doing good.
Okay. I came to LACMA just a little bit less than 15 years ago, after having been in museum education as a former teacher of adults and children. And I decided I wanted to be a docent, and I was going to learn however anyone wanted me to learn. I just wanted to tour the public. So when I started in the program, we were completely self-run. And it was interesting. To me, it was a little bit boring. I didn't feel as stimulated as I do now by our interaction with the education department. As we progressed, what did you say, 2008?
Yeah, 2008.
2008, education began to introduce interactive tours, particularly when the BCAM building, the Broad Contemporary Art Museum, opened. And many of us, for a variety of reasons, were introduced to conversation-based learning. And I found it to be such a successful tool in engaging the audience. So I was quickly won over to the change in the touring style. And then it became a requirement that everybody retrain in this, and we were retrained. Public tour docents don't have to use this style of touring. I know I do because it's comfortable for me. School tour docents do use it. Now, in about, let's see, I've been a trainer twice. So one was in the old style. One I had the privilege of training with Kristen, a group of docents. And I really enjoy the ability to facilitate these conversations and to keep honing the skills of how to do this more effectively. And to see the reactions with the kids and the adults in the gallery. It has not always been an easy transition. Many of our former docents are not happy with being education, quote, running us, but that is not the case. As former chair last year, I felt very listened to by our VP of Public Programs and Kristen on various issues that were evolving in terms of our coaching. And so I see it that our teaching plans, which are our collaboration, are very much a collaboration between the docents and the staff, so that we have really outstanding teaching plans when we're out there with lots of options. So, okay, I am anyway. Yeah, go ahead. So that's.
I didn't mean to cut you off, Ellen. We're going to have more time to talk about a lot of this too. Yeah.
Sorry.
We all just have so much to share.
I know, we're
It's
so
hard to stop
excited.
talking. Well, hi, everyone. Again, I'm Tiffany Wiley, and I oversee the volunteer program for, thank you, the Natural History Museum and the La Brea Tar Pits. What's going on back there? Oh, yeah. That's us. And I just want to talk a little bit about who we are as a family of museums. So we all share the same vision to inspire wonder, discovery, and responsibility for our natural and cultural worlds. I think one of the things that makes this vision statement special, especially when it comes to the work that our volunteers and docents do in the floor of the museum and in the exhibitions, is that this is a mission that we can all achieve and that we all have a part in playing. If the institution had a mission or a vision statement that was really focused on collections work or collections care or something like that, that would be a really different world for all of us to live in. But in this case, all of us as museum educators, whether we are paid or unpaid, can and do have a responsibility to inspire our guests, and that is the driving force behind our work. And that's something that really ties all of us together in a way that's incredibly powerful. And that's meaningful because when we talk about the structure of our education department, it's a big department. Our Vice President of Education and Programs oversees a number of different divisions that all kind of work together to meet the needs of our various audiences. So we have a division under Education and Programs focused entirely on school and teacher programs and oversees the mobile museums team that goes out into the world. We have a division that focuses on public programs and all of the kind of ways that we can engage adults and kids and families and tourists and all kinds of folks for free at the museum throughout the year, with I think over 100 public programs being offered annually for those audiences. And then we also have 2 key divisions, because one of them is our division, which is volunteer programs. And I partner very closely with our interpretation and training department within education and programs. And what that means is that all of the volunteers and docents are housed in education, have been since the early days of the docent-led association and roundtable, and continue to be today, and are closely partnered and aligned with our professional educators, the gallery interpreters who operate under the interpretation and training department, and that our 2 departments work together to ensure that we are meeting those content-related needs of the museum, and that we're kind of working together, as you can see in our draft or our previous mission statement for the education department, that we're really focused on helping our guests to find relevancy in our museum's content and to make it make sense for them, so that somebody who is a lifelong learner and passionate about science or history and knows, all the names of the dinosaurs, which is every 11-year-old that comes to our institution, is going to have just as powerful of an experience as somebody who was dragged there, whether by a family member or a date or a school group, right? And didn't necessarily get to choose to come. And we want to kind of meet them where they are and provide them with experiences that are going to be meaningful to them so that they go away with something that they can then build on their own. And that's really what our entire department is focused on. So, the Education and Programs department is quite large. We have about 100 paid staff. The volunteer programs department, though, is really 3 people, myself and 2 managers who are each site dedicated, one at the Natural History Museum and one at La Brea Tar Pits, focused on supporting our fabulous volunteers and docents. And just to kind of speak briefly to the structure of the docent associations for the 2 institutions, because unfortunately the Docent Roundtable wasn't able to join me here today and sends their regrets. But we do have 2 strong docent associations at both the Natural History Museum and the La Brea Tar Pits, who partner closely with us within volunteer programs. But there's a slightly different structure there. Those organizations are more focused on providing kind of powerful additional offerings for the members of our volunteer program who have achieved docent status. So membership to those associations is optional. People can kind of opt in once they achieve docent status through our training structure, which I can talk about in a moment. And then our associations are really focused on providing field trips and lectures and social gatherings and all kinds of things that are going to be powerful additions to the volunteer experience of those docents. And so we work really closely with them to help support and plan and pull those pieces together. We have about, over the course of a given year, we'll have, say, 700 to 750 folks offering volunteer service at the 3 museums. At any given time, about 500 of those are currently active. And then we have, I think I might have it up here. Wait a minute. I do, look at that. We have about 350 folks focused specifically on floor interpretation. So the remainder of those folks working behind the scenes with our research and collections. About 125 of those across the 2 institutions are docent status, and about 100 or so of those are members of our docent organizations, maybe a little bit less than that. Looking at those numbers. And at any given time, we have about 30 folks who have achieved a docent in training status and are on their way up up to that docent status and would then be eligible to join the roundtable or the association at either institution. So again, I'll talk a little more about those statuses and that training program. Another thing that I think is important to think about when you think about our volunteer program, which is again inclusive of all of our docents, is that over the course of the last 15 years, as we've been going through a bit of a transition with kind of the work that our docent roundtable and association are doing independently versus in partnership with volunteer programs, and the subsequent massive trainings to the training structure that have occurred in partnership with those associations, is that we now have a pretty broad diversity in terms of ages within our program. So about 45% at this moment are under the age of 30. And so at any given time, really, we have about 30% 55 and over, 30% between 30 and 55, and about 30% under 30. And again, that fluctuates throughout the year. And these numbers are accurate as of kind of right now, right at this moment. So seasonality kind of affects things. But I think that's worth mentioning because I think it will make sense as we start to talk about the training program and how that has affected the diversity and inclusion of the program as well, since that's one of our topics for today. So thank you all. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. Could you send? Oh, thank you.
I can. It's right here.
Okay, so we are from the Ronald Reagan Library. And as Rebecca mentioned, that we actually have a very unique situation because I work for the foundation and all the docents are under the National Archives. So sometimes when I'm explaining that to people, they literally gasp, like, oh, how do you work with two different entities like that? The education department actually does it very well. I don't know how that was set up, but we do start with training from both docent and our education department. So I will put up our mission. The library mission is to preserve and share President Reagan's legacy. I'm going to say within that, with our education department, one of the things that we are very big on is a lot of people think that, oh, that was a Republican president. So sometimes people are leery about that. We are actually a history museum that happens to present President Reagan, and we share that legacy. So I am clear, I want you to be clear on that because we are one of the things that our biggest goal is to make sure students feel safe when they're with us. And I don't mean physically, I mean that they know that they're welcome with us. And when we're presenting history, we also don't interpret for them, we present it. And so we'll talk more about this in training, but sometimes when we're talking about something that President Reagan, some people might seem, that, oh, that was mean. Like when we talk about PATCO, when he let go 10,000 of air traffic controllers because they were striking. We talk about how they weren't allowed to strike in their contract, and they did anyway. We ask the students, what do you think about that? Well, some students will say, because they've also had history of maybe their parents being laid off, they might say, well, that's horrible. Some kids, and I do work with a lot of fifth graders, will look at us and say, wow, that's interesting because he meant what he said. So we don't say that that's right or wrong. And I just want you to know that our education department is we are very big on making sure all students feel welcome where we are. So that's part of our mission. If you look at our education mission, we are actually, we strive to cultivate the next generation of leaders. We do that throughout all of our programs. And all of our programs also we are skills-based when we're teaching students. And we work on communication skills, we work with leadership skills, optimism, because President Reagan was known for his optimism, and also something called informed decision-making. We don't want students just making decisions, we want them to be informed about what they're making decisions about. And that is across the board for our education department. So if you look up here, we have our education department is broken into 4 key branches. I'll call them branches. I'm going to start with our university programs. We actually have a university program in Washington, D.C. It's leadership in the American president. We have scholarships. We give over $1.2 million to students. We have outreach and engagement. That's local and national. Yikes. Local and national student and teacher programs. And one of my programs is the Air Force One Discovery Center. And that is actually an interactive tour simulation where we simulate the invasion of Grenada. So we actually have 3 rooms. We call them modules: an Oval Office, a command decision center, and a press room where students actually get to portray real people from that time period. So fifth graders come and play President Reagan, or they might be the bureau chief of the press corps, or they might be General Vesey. So that is where we integrate our docents, because our docents, the modules are led by credentialed teachers, but our docents also will tour our students with the field trips, and they train with us as well. They have their own training, which Fonda will talk about in a minute, but they also train with us. So when they are doing tours throughout the museum, they are also making sure they're bringing in a lot of what they've learned in Discovery Center about Grenada, and just to kind of tie into us. So we actually work very well together, even though we are two different entities. So I think this is where I'm going to let you talk about your docent program.
Okay, I'm the education chair at the Reagan Library, and how do you become a docent? What's the training there? Well, there's a classroom training, which involves about it's about a 6-week program, and it's about 3 hours a day, 3 hours a week for 6 weeks. And then we have what you call your on-the-job training, and that's when you go on your shift. How do we incorporate the Discovery Center in our training, and they incorporate us, how we work together, is that our trainees actually go through an evening of Discovery Center training. So they will become a 5th grader for a 3-hour period. They play the role of President Reagan, and they do everything a child would do. And then I think what I'll do is I'll stop there, and we'll go over more about how the training program goes. Oh, okay. Yes, we do have our own council. We're one of the only presidential libraries that have our own council. We're a 10-member council, starting with the president, and as you can see, we go on down the list: the president, first vice president, second vice president, treasurer, secretary, museum coordinator, education committee chair, which is what I am, special events, library representative, past president. We meet once a month. We all work together to make our programs work. We all specialize in one of these areas. For instance, a museum coordinator would work with the daily coordinators, bring all the information to the daily coordinators, and that way docents and daily coordinators can work together. Special events chair would be all these special events that come to the Reagan Library. How do docents sign up for those events, and how do we work those events? So we all have a place on this council. You are voted. It's a vote. It's a once-a-year vote. It's a 2-year term where you term out in 2 years, but it's voted every year. I think that's it.
Thanks, Wanda. I really appreciate it. So in thinking about these 3 different institutions and their various structures, we're going to kind of shift the conversation and really kind of begin with training. Museums over the course of their existence they go through phases, and they change and they evolve. And I think museum education within the past 10 years is really evolving. It became a professionalized field roughly about the 1960s, so when a lot of these docent corps and institutions were emerging. And then over the years, there's been a really big shift, and specifically more recently talking about diversity and inclusion and accessibility. How can we make sure that both our internal staff and volunteers and our audiences are finding relevance in the work in which we're doing inside our walls? So in thinking about that, I'm curious if anybody wanted to share kind of their best practices on how you go about training both your staff and your volunteer staff to keep up with these best practices and overseeing these shifts.
Okay. So for LACMA, and Ellen was touching on this when she was speaking, in the early 2000s, we went through a major change to go from touring that, how would you describe the previous touring?
We had a series of questions that were not so much open-ended, but they were specific questions that we designed to reference categories like color, space, history, and I think it was less looking at the art.
Yeah, that's a good, I like that description of it. So we had a shift where we were learning it's really the power of looking at a work of art for a good chunk of time and really going in depth with it, and the ability for students to come to their own interpretations of what they're seeing, and that there's not just one interpretation of the work of art. And so we termed this conversation-based teaching, which is an inquiry method. And we asked docents to think about ways to revise their questions so they could be more open-ended versus, what color is the hat? How would you describe the colors in this painting? Things like that. And so one of the key things was this was a really collaborative change and shift. And so my predecessor, who was the manager of gallery learning then, put together a learning team of docents and sat down and figured out how could we go about training people to use this method. And that team then came up with a plan, and then in 2011, we recruited a new group of docents and trained them in that method. It was a year-long training program, and then the following year they were on the floor actually touring with students. And then after the success of that, we put together another team of docents to be trainers to then go through and train all of the school tour docents. So that was another year-long. We divided it. It was actually more like 6 or 7 weeks, I think. So we offered that twice the following year for all of the veteran docents. And so that's
about a 3 to 4 hour commitment every afternoon. It was a 3 to 4 hour commitment, so it was really an intense introduction to the whole process.
And we spent a lot of time in the galleries, and so that's kind of how we made that big shift with training. And then in terms of ongoing training, we have what we call our continuing education lectures that there's 12 of those a year. They range from exhibition curators talking about exhibitions, so you can learn about the exhibitions that are coming up, to workshops specifically focused on teaching. So if there's something we feel we're hearing from tour chairs that needs more focus, maybe it's how to create those really interactive activities, we'll make a workshop out of that. And then last year, we instituted things called route meetings, where once a month, docents that are touring on the same flight plan would get together and share strategies. And there was this one grade, I can't remember if you were at this route meeting, where one docent said, I'm touring with this folding screen, and I'm having trouble approaching it. Like, are other people having these problems? And 3 other people raised their hand and said, oh, I love that object. This is how I do it. And so it was a really great opportunity to share with each other teaching successes. So that's something we're continuing this year too.
Can I just jump in? Or okay. So I wanted we could do something similar as well. As we provide, I want to call them, professional development. We do a lot of training, but I'm going to jump ahead real quick and then go back to the training. We, for our professional development, we will provide some events maybe around autism, how to deal with students who have autism, what are some best practices there. And we also always invite the docents to join us with that. So we try to present things throughout the year of things that maybe people are struggling with. And actually, that was a docent idea. A docent came up to us one day and said, I'm struggling, I don't know how to deal with this. And I said, oh my gosh, I know someone who can come talk. So we do a lot of talking with docents as well. We do a lot of observations for our training. So yeah, you have a manual, you learn all this stuff about the Cold War and President Reagan. That's the boring part of it. But once you know that and you actually get up there and you get to practice that, you first start by observing, then you can actually get your hands on that and say, I want to try this tour, and we do that. We also work a lot with connections. So, 5th graders, they don't care what happened in 1983. 1983 might as well have been when President Lincoln was born, because they don't care. So we work really, really hard to just do connections. So in our first part of our gallery, we have something with President Reagan. He's just growing up, and he's very poor, and so we talk about that. And we have kids, we show docents as well as our own staff how to do this, where we actually have them observe, what are you seeing? And, pictures behind, what do you think of President Reagan's family? What can you tell about them? We want them to be able to interpret this information. We want them to, we can tell them whatever we want, but most likely they're not going to leave thinking, they're not going to remember everything I said. I also speak very fast, so I don't know how much they actually get out of that. But when you're stopping and you're showing this, and you're saying, here's President Reagan, and they can tell that he was from humble roots. They say, oh, he didn't have a lot of money. Correct. What else? They're looking around, and then they say, oh, he played football. Well, last week we had a student who said, okay, wait a minute. He was poor, and he played football. He worked really hard, and he became president? I said, yes. He said, I don't have a lot of money. I love football, and I also like to swim. He said, could I be president? I said, absolutely, you could. That, right there, light bulb moment. That's what we teach. We want everyone to feel that connection. So that's that's something you have to observe. So we do a lot of that with our training.
Things that I want to say is that the way the docents work with the Discovery Center in teaching our docents how to speak with a 5th grader and 8th grader is that we follow them. They'll be giving a tour, and we'll have a docent follow them. There's a different language in talking to a 5th grader versus a senior. And you really want to just grab those 5th graders. You want to grab those older kids, and you want to get them included. Discovery Center teaches us a lot about how you word our tours. So we learn a lot from them.
Tiffany, I was wondering if you could talk about how your institution approaches collaborating on the training that is given out to your volunteers, kind of who's at the table, and then how is it rolled out and facilitated?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is one of the things that is a little bit different about how we operate at the Natural History Museum in La Brea Tar-Pits too. One of the important things I think to know about the educational the mission of our folks who are working in the exhibits on the floor with our guests is that our volunteers and docents are focused not on touring, but on thematic conversations with our guests. So again, part of this ethos to meet our visitors where they are, to help, to allow the visitor to kind of lead with what they're interested in, what are they looking at, rather than kind of defining that for them. One of the reasons that we do that is because we did some visitor surveying and found that for our audience at the Natural History Museum, tours were less of interest. People weren't really looking for that. They wanted to lead their own experience. And so one of the ways that we could continue to help them build those connections with our collections was to literally be in the exhibitions, meet them where they are, and craft interpretive conversations that are thematic and that give them something to kind of build a framework of understanding around and to take with them, while allowing them to lead, focusing on the questioning strategies that I think have been mentioned here, and then trying to build towards those inspirational moments as well. So in order to prepare people to do that, because that's not a natural way that we talk to each other, right? It's not necessarily instinctive for all of us. Yes, thank you for asking that. The question was, what do I mean by thematic? So an example would be, if you were working in our nature lab, for example, our theme for that hall is that Los Angeles is home to surprising biodiversity. And so we want people to leave with that understanding, whether they know what the species are that live in Los Angeles, or the body temperature of an opossum, or what the endangered species of here or there are, or kind of where you can find P22 or not, in Los Angeles, if any of you who have heard of that iconic cougar living in Griffith Park. So these are stories that we can use to share this idea, this story around the biodiversity that lives in Los Angeles. And our goal as interpreters is for our visitors to leave with that. And if they were to go home and say, what'd you talk about? What'd you learn? I learned about the biodiversity of Los Angeles and how many species. It's really surprising to me, right? These are the words we want to hear as we're evaluating afterwards, to find that we were successful in getting that message across, so that we're not really focusing on facts. and the retention of those facts. But again, speaking thematically is hard. You know, a guest is asking me questions about spiders or ants or rattlesnakes or whatever, and I'm in the nature lab, and how do I get the conversation to come back to this home that LA provides for a surprising number of species in LA, including us? And what is my role in kind of getting the conversation to go that direction? So that's what our training focuses on. And we pair a formal training process with an intensive coaching process for our volunteers. And that starts day one with our orientation. But I have to mention that one of the kind of key components of this is that we have moved away from a classic docent class structure. So we're no longer doing like an annual training of a group of docents and moving them then into, say, a 2-year commitment to the institution going forward, or whatever the kind of model is that comes to mind. For us, what we've moved towards is roughly monthly orientations. We generally orient about 15 to 20 people on average, let's say, focusing just on NHM, just on the Natural History Museum right now. And in that orientation, not only are we introducing them to the volunteer program, to the expectations, to the offerings, to the opportunities, trying to kind of find a love match between what they're looking for in this incredible donation of their time, as well as what we can offer. We're also starting to train them on the basics of interpretation and the vocabulary that we use as we start to thinking about open-ended questions and crafting those and putting those pieces together and thinking about tangibles and intangibles and these kinds of buzzwords that we use when we're thinking about crafting those conversations. So they come out of orientation, they can get started on the floor right away, practicing at some starter stations, pairing content with this delivery method. And then we offer, roughly monthly, sometimes kind of every other month. We then offer formal trainings for specific halls within the museum. And volunteers can then sign up to attend one of those trainings if they're particularly interested in Dinosaur Hall, and Dino Hall training is coming up, or Butterfly Pavilion, or Gems and Mineral Hall, or whatever it is that is exciting to them. That training then pairs content delivery by our curatorial staff, so it's access to the experts, the curators who are delivering that content and working in partnership with us to define what content they're going to be delivering around that hall. And then we spend the second half of that training really focusing on unpacking that information. Okay, so then now how do we apply that? Let's practice. What does that look like? Let's try and put some conversations together. Let's do some modeling with each other. And there's a certification process that goes along with that. And so once they get certified, they earn not only a pin to put on the lanyard, but also the ability to then be stationed in those additional halls. And that allows volunteers to kind of choose their own adventure when it comes to the content connected experience at the museum. If they, are like me and find geology kind of overwhelming, they might not choose to go to Gem and Mineral Hall training, or maybe they will for the challenge of it all. Or some folks, just fall in love with the pavilions, and that's the only place that they want to hang out surrounded by flying butterflies. Who wouldn't want to do that? On the other hand, we have quite a few folks who choose to take, every training they can get their hands on, because as we all know, what often draws all of us to museums is this passion for lifelong learning. And so as a result, that's how folks will kind of move through that engagement structure in order to achieve docent status, and essentially the equivalent of the training, the knowledge, the skill that you would demonstrate if you went through a more classic kind of docent training class, right? And kind of over the course of a year, you might then earn enough of those certifications to show that equivalency and then achieve that docent status. And then I'll just quickly add, I know this was a bit long-winded, but then on a day-to-day, when folks are working in the halls and coming in for their regular shifts and being stationed kind of outside of that training structure, we pair group as well as one-on-one where possible, coaching for the volunteers on these shifts, working with some of our paid educators to hone those skills, achieve those certifications, practice together, look for those best practices, find those opportunities to get a little bit closer to those inspirational moments as they possibly can, and continue to kind of build that skill base as they move forward. So again, that commitment to knowledge and skill, and then honoring the personal commitment being made by these folks in terms of service hours, and kind of adding all of that up to that docent status. And it's at that point then that they are able to join the Docent Roundtable or the Docent Association at the two organizations and start to take part in those fantastic series of offerings that those two groups are providing for docents in training and docents as well.
Great. So I think this first set of, kind of sharing experiences really is over seeing the shift in education in museums towards engagement. And you start seeing this in a lot of new departments are being put under not necessarily an education department, but maybe a visitor engagement department or visitor experiences. When I got promoted, I got to pick my title, and I purposefully kept education out of it because I wanted to focus on our work to be engaging and looking at those connections in what we're doing. So in thinking about that, another big shift in the field that we are embracing is really talking intentionally about diversity and inclusion. And the American Alliance of Museums has done a lot of work on this. They just published, as I mentioned earlier, a full year study on this diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility research. And so I encourage you, if you're interested in that type of work, to look it up on their website. They have a really great accessible guide. But kind of in thinking about that, it means not only do we need to be engaging, but we also need to be inclusive, both for our internal teams and our audiences that are coming through our doors. And so I was wondering if we can kind of speak about how do we create an inclusive environment for those who are coming and spending time with us.
Sure. Should I kick us off? Sure. All right. Well, that's one of our values, right, is what we put under accessibility, but I think it's that idea of creating a really welcoming environment for all of our visitors. So in our trainings, we've had classes on how to incorporate English language learners into your tours. So how do you adjust your questioning, your activities for people who English might not be their first language, to make sure we reach our whole group. We've also done, in 2016, after the election, we were having a lot of students who were saying comments on tours that they were reflecting how scared they were about the current climate. For example, one docent asked this really open-ended question looking at a port scene of a painting to say, imagine you were sailing into this port. What do you, like, I'm demonstrating a bad open-ended question. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? And the student said, oh, I wouldn't leave where I am. I could maybe not be able to get back in. And so there were some questions like that were coming up that were really, the docents were wanting some more guidance on. So we did a training session on being inclusive in your teaching. And so we, as a group, tried to define what that means, and from being welcoming to the types of objects you're picking to put on your tours that you're representing. We're an encyclopedic collection. You want to make sure your tour is balanced. You have women on your tour, female artists of color. So it kind of, we're still working on this with the council and as a department. And most recently, we did a training on implicit bias with a professor of psychology from Morehouse College. That was really interesting. So looking inward at ourselves as teachers too. So those are kind of some key areas we've been exploring.
To build on that, because a lot of that resonates with me as well. I think something that's interesting when it comes to volunteer and docent programs, especially when we are housed or connected to in some way museum education departments. We are in a sense a program itself. Addressing the needs of an audience, which is our volunteers and our docents who are members of our museum audience and who are coming to us for a certain kind of experience. And so how do we work with those volunteers and docents to make sure that we're providing as inclusive and diverse of an experience as they are looking for, and to be a home for any kind of volunteer, somebody who's knows everything there is to know about a certain topic that we have at our museum, or somebody who just is like, I just want to do something different. I don't know anything about science or history, and to provide a home for those folks as well. So I feel like, looking at the inclusion and diversity question from that perspective, as well as, so importantly, as we think about our audiences and who's coming to us and how do we then, provide them with the right kind of experiences, everything from language to technique that we're going to use to engage them, whether they are 3 or 33 or 93, or whether they, have any kind of background in the topics that we're discussing or not. And so these are kind of all the things floating around in my head as I'm thinking about these topics. But one thing that I do want to kind of tease out, which I think is connected to what I was speaking about before when it comes to training, is that, one of the museum's real commitments, and this was in partnership with our docent roundtable at the Natural History Museum, was that we wanted our volunteer program itself to be more diverse and to be as inclusive as possible to the Los Angeles community. One of our current strategic goals at the museum is to be a museum of, for, and with Los Angeles. When we think about our visitorship, when we think about our membership, when we think about the people who come to the institution, it's important that we also think about one of our most important and connected bases, which is our volunteers and docents. And so how do we make sure that as many of the folks in Los Angeles who are interested in donating their time to our institution are able to do that? One of the ways that we did that was by altering that training structure, so that we're no longer offering orientations just at set times, or we're no longer offering trainings just at certain parts of the year, or with a heavy kind of weekly requirement for months at a time, or we're not even necessarily asking folks to make an initial 2-year or 1-year commitment to us. We're asking for 3 months. What they tend to do is commit about a year or a little bit more than that, and many of them much longer. But that initial barrier has then been lowered. So all of these different things that we're trying to do, including every time we hold an exhibition training, we hold it on a weekday and a weekend session, so that we're as available throughout the week as possible to folks who, because of family obligations, because of work obligations, because of personal obligations, whatever the case may be, might not be able to get to us on one of those 2 days. So we want to just try and be as accessible as we can. And we're currently looking into digital offerings for trainings. I'm feeling a little bit nervous about that, but right now we're kind of still exploring these types of ways that we can open things up. And as a result, we have diversified in many ways. Age is one of them. I mentioned that. We see more representation from different Los Angeles communities within our volunteer program. It's certainly not perfect, and it certainly has a long way for us to go to really embrace and be as reflective of LA as we want to be. But these are some of the things that I think about when I'm really working closely with our docent roundtable, our association, as well as the other education staff at the museum, and to try and kind of embody those strategic goals and values of inclusivity and diversity, not just for our program and its members as volunteers and docents, but then turning that back around and extending that out to our visitors who are coming to meet us as well.
Love that idea. I think we might steal that for our training.
I think we'll all be stealing a lot from each other after today, probably.
I just wanted to talk quickly about inclusion for us. We do a lot of training with that. We're starting to really do more and more of it. In fact, I have a colleague in the back, Ruben. Just say hi. Thanks, Ruben. Ruben and I recently did empathy training with our staff. And I know sometimes when you hear that, you're like, oh, really? I don't think we told the staff that it was called empathy training. We just said, come in and do this. Okay. So one of the things we did is we had I'm an example person because I just feel like it's better than you might be able to connect with this a little bit better. We had a little beach ball. We had a group in a circle. Some people had cards that said, stand up and pass the ball, but don't pass it to the person with a yellow card. The yellow card said, just stand up and pass the ball. And then there were 2 people who were observers. So what happens is we did this in a couple different groups, and they're playing, and the person with the yellow card is not getting the ball, and they're looking around. The first person's looking around like, why am I not getting the ball? What's going on? And then I saw the first one jump up and try to catch it. And she couldn't, and she was like, what is going on? And the others won't look at her, okay? So all of a sudden, their eyes went down. That was the first one. The second one, the second group, totally different group, comes in, and they're doing the same thing, and the person just stood there. She completely shut down. Now, this is an adult. She completely shut down. She was like, why am I not getting the ball? You could see her face, but it ended there. She did not try to get the ball. You could see, she shut down. That was a perfect example of what happens with kids when they feel left out. And so those types of trainings, when you do it regularly, and just, you don't have to shove it down someone's throat, but those little activities really show what it's like to be left out. At the Reagan, we are trying to do more and more with technology, especially in the Discovery Center, where low vision students, we're working with technology for that. We're working for using captioning a lot in our Air Force One Discovery Center, because that works with autistic kids who either are deaf or hard of hearing, but also second language learners. So we are also trying to do that. But our big training is when you have examples like that, when they can feel left out or different, it's a really good way to train. And then we talk about what that means and how to implement that. Everything with our education department now, we don't just say, here's an email on how to do it. We also give them language to do so. So we give them actual scenarios. Hey, what if this happened on your tour? Talk about this. How can you actually use language to make that better? And that's how we do our training.
So I do want to leave time for questions, and so I kind of want to shift us into our last topic, was about evaluation. Now, evaluation is tough as educators and as somebody who constantly works on, grant reports or maybe board reports, and I'm trying to get people jazzed and pumped about education. Evaluation is that key, because we have loads of anecdotal, situational, qualitative data that we can provide, those warm fuzzies of students having those aha moments, or a staff member that was transformed by being exposed to a training. But the quantitative, how do we measure what success looks like as an educator, is really tough. And nobody wants to start introducing standardized testing into museum education. That sounds terrible. So because I want us to be brief, in 1 minute, we're just going to go down the line. I want you guys to describe what success looks like for a museum educator and docent.
Ooh, I like that question. What does success look like? We had an activity once where we had people visualize that, and you have the docent or the educator in the center, and you have your students around, and that the conversation is arrows going back and forth and side to side, so it's not just one person talking back and forth. And I think it's that really rich conversation where students are having multiple interpretations of the work of art that they're looking at, and everyone's participating, and you're just going really deep with that particular object. Ellen, I don't know if you have a...
Yeah, Ellen, what does success look like for you?
Well, the same, but I had an experience where I was touring in the Renaissance galleries, and after the tour, which was an interactive tour, a woman came up to me and she said, now I really understand what the difference between the early, late Renaissance and the Manners period was. I can take this to any museum and really know what I'm looking at. And to me, that was like, wow, that was great. And there was a lot of conversation.
Oh, that's very cool. I've got one. Thank you. Musical microphones. Well, for us, I think what I'll share is when it comes to our engagement with our guests, what does success look like? Because there's a whole lot of different ways that I try and evaluate success when I think about the volunteer and docent experience as well. But I think specifically when we're thinking about engaging with our guests, we're looking for the guests to have a positive, interactive, engaging experience, and to leave with that kind of big story that we want to try and share with them. We want them to walk away kind of with that in their pocket and to be able to apply that forward. That's where those thematic conversations come in. But the experience of getting to that theme is really important. So we do, also look for those types of positive experiences, and particularly wanting the conversation to be led by that visitor. So we want them to be guiding the curiosity and the exploration, and the interpreter, the volunteer or the docent, to be kind of helping facilitate that conversation and crafting it around that theme based on the interests of the audience. So we do have like a rubric and kind of an evaluative tool that we use with them to get them to that point, but that's what success looks like for us.
So when you're talking about success, are you talking about with kids or with?
Like, what is a successful, like, you're thinking about, like, what does a successful tour look like for you?
So for me is, you guys keep saying engagement. When the kids are just staring at you, and I'm funny, and if they're not laughing, you know, there's a problem there. No, I really like when they're interactive and engaged. That's when you know. But when they make those connections, like I spoke earlier, you know, we actually have the memorial of President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan on site, and typically when they walk over there, that's really where you see them moved, because they will say, "Wow, I'm actually standing next to the President of the United States." It's funny that they make that connection. So for me, when I see kids make a connection and they're interacting with me and they're not just staring at me like I'm from another planet, then I know I've done a good job.
For me, as an educator and as a chair of the education committee, you know, I always wonder, when is that docent ready to go on tour? When is that docent ready to lead their own tour? We actually have an evaluation tour in which they're followed by an education committee member if they meet certain requirements. And we're not asking for way extensive, that they meet, that they won't look like a docent of 3 years when they're taking this tour. They look like a docent of 6 weeks. But can they present information? Are they exciting? Are they engaging? And that way we know that this person has the ability to go out and lead their own tour, and we know that we did a good job in training. That evaluation tour sums up the whole training.
As I was doing some research throughout the week preparing for today, I came across this website, and I wish I had actually written it down, but it's by docents nationally, and you can submit your docent stories, and they kind of scroll through the front, and one docent said that he felt success was this one time he had an experience where he was leading a family, and when he said goodbye at the end of the tour, a young boy reached into his pocket and gave him a $1 bill and said that this was the best experience, and he wanted him to be paid for it, which I just thought was cute and wanted to share. So with that in mind, we've shared a lot of great resources and kind of talked about our different experiences within these institutions. We want to open it up for questions. We have about 15 minutes. Since it is being recorded, we have some mics that are going to go around.
You can actually take your guys' mics. We just then share those. Okay, great.
This is a question for the LACMA. You mentioned that the public docents, the docents who give public tours don't use the conversation style engagement. And then I just was doing the math, and I was trying to figure out if 77 docents are giving some kind of tour, what are the other 100 active members doing? So it's a two-part question.
Sure. Okay, so the first part was the technique that the public tour docents are using on their tours. Right, and I should just point out that some of them are starting to, but we didn't do a formal training program with the public tour docents like we did with the school tour docents on the conversation-based technique. But what we found is docents that were trained in that for school tour docents that have kind of gone over onto the public tour side are bringing that with them, because like Ellen had spoke about, they're finding it as a really good way to engage with visitors.
Well, for example, if you're doing a special exhibition tour and you may have 12 to 15 objects that you're looking at in approximately 50 minutes, you obviously cannot do every piece that way, but you can get the docents, get the public to look and get an idea about what the period might be and get them to converse on specific pieces and then take that information to the next pieces so that they're actually doing what the kids do, just not at every piece because the time would be prohibitive. But a lot of our docents are beginning to do this, and in fact, we're going to have a training this year for all the docents to be able to learn this skill to the degree that they want to do it.
Right, thanks. And so it's kind of optional right now, I guess is how I would describe it. And your second question was about the numbers of docents, right? And so there's 177 who are active members. The remainder of those are what we call our sustainer status. Is that what you were curious about? Yeah, so the sustainer status means they've toured for 10 years, and then for various reasons they might decide to go sustainer, and they keep their membership, they keep their free parking, they come and attend our continuing education lectures. We have a lot of social events too that they participate in, and then sometimes we do some specific events just for the sustainers. So that's why the numbers are so different.
Okay, I had a question. We talked a lot about touring. What about, and I've been to your institute, I've been to most of your institutions, LACMA more than the others, but I've rarely seen docents on the floor. And I mean, are they there? And I just don't see them. But I mean, I mean, you do have docents on the floor that are just doing casual interactions and are not just there to do tours, right?
We have a combination. So we do offer tours every day. Yeah, we have a highlights tour, we have an in-focus tour, things like that. We also have a program called Explore Art, where docents are kind of stationed near the entrance to the building, and the goal there was kind of picking up on your idea of having informal conversations with visitors and just helping them through the visit. But yeah, we offer a lot of tours, so.
If you've been there in the morning, you would not see public tours going on, because we leave that time open for school tours. So they begin at noon every day, and then there's usually 4 or 5 tours, and then there's so many buildings at this moment in time that you may not have seen a special exhibition tour going on.
At Reagan, we have special stations. We have 22 stations throughout the museum. We have 2 shifts a day. We are always at those specific stations. They're mandatory. During our morning hours, we have lots of school children tours. We're just packed, especially during the week. But on a daily basis, we are at those stations, and we take those stations very seriously. They become our mini tour. No, what we do, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking. You know, what we do is we're at the station for 30 minutes, and then we're there, we rotate. So we're rotating stations throughout a side of the library. What we call a side of the library would be side A, President Reagan's younger years, his governor years. And we'll be at station, this one for 30 minutes, rotate another 30 minutes. We follow a station chart. No, they actually have let me explain it just a little bit more thorough, okay? We have 2 shifts a day. We have 14 shifts a week. Therefore, we have 14 daily coordinators who run those shifts. The daily coordinators are the ones that are responsible for their schedules. They hand out the station schedules at their shift meeting in the morning or in the afternoon. So you're reporting to your daily coordinator.
Are you asking, do they move, or do they just stay on their bench? Yeah, so they come to you, but you also will walk around that room.
Okay, I understand. Sorry, I didn't get it. Okay, yes, we engage with the guests. We're looking for the guests who are, not listening to their audio, because some of those guests don't want to be talked to. They'll come to you. But we look for the guests who look like they may want to engage in conversation. So we're constantly talking about that gallery or any questions that they may have.
Hello. That was loud. I'm just going to share my perspective as a docent here. I've only been a docent for 2 years. My favorite part of being a docent and what makes tours successful for me is if I know what's magical about the artifacts here, and that comes across. So in all this training talk, what would be amazing training for us is to have people that are amazingly inspired and excited about their education share that with us, and we can share it forward. A lot of meeting people where they are is trying to make up for the fact that we don't actually know what's great about a lot of the artifacts here. And having people be able to take pictures, meeting them with language, giving them themes, I understand what's happening there, but nothing can beat like a presentation with someone who just loves an object or just can make something alive. And I would love to see more of that in training, because the artifacts are bigger than all the themes we're talking about. And if the education gets to a point where it's themes and takeaway points, that's the point at which I would stop being a docent, because for me, I'm in it for lifelong learning, and it's the magic. And as you said, it's that transformative, really the lofty goal, and we just have to keep a balance of those two things. If it becomes commoditized or a product, it'll lose the magic, and all of the people will feel it, and we'll feel it. And so for me, that's the most important thing. Like even at this gallery, if I could just, I love the other docents here because they make everything alive, and I try to sneak in on their tours. If I know they love something, I go on my day off and I stay at their tours. And for me, that's still the best type of education. And in all of this, I see that missing or left out. And so that's just my personal perspective as just a 2-year, very young, very new docent. But that's what brings me here. It's magical, and that's what I like to leave with people, that it's amazing, you know, like everybody knows what it's like to be in front of the Mona Lisa and just be like reading facts about it or taking notes about it. It's like, how do we make this alive? And not with phrases, but really embodied for us and then for the people that are here.
That's really
So I actually, to your point, I think one of the things that we're trying, I think that a lot of us are getting at, is that it's a combination, and it is that delicate balance, that the content is illuminated through sometimes of these skill sets that have to be sharpened, you know, exercised, almost like a muscle. So in thinking about, and so some of those trainings, and I oversee a national professional development program for museum educators, and professional development just makes me want to roll my eyes sometimes, because I was like, professional development, I get it. But it's about creating opportunities for you to either be exposed to really dynamic content that is inspiring, and then coupling that with the skill sets and like exercising those muscles so that whomever's coming through your doors, you can create those transformative kind of experiences. And so I definitely hear what you're saying, because it's a balance between the two, and inspires what you do.
Yeah, and I just want to build on that by saying I could not agree more. I mean, the inspiration of the content that's on display, the amazing connection that we have, the ability, I mean, why else are we at a museum if not to stand next to these amazing artifacts or specimens or displays and feel a visceral connection to the natural world, the cultural world, the historical context for those pieces. There's a story to be told at our museums in a way that it is almost impossible to tell anywhere else. And that is why we're here, right? That's what's so exciting about this work. And that, you know, none of our educational techniques can work in the absence of content knowledge. And none of our content knowledge can reach the level of inspiration without the application of techniques that help to engage our audiences, right? And so, yeah, the mirroring of those two pieces, the connection between those two pieces, that's the balance we're all struggling to find. And I gotta say, sometimes I do it really well, and sometimes I leave a conversation and I'm like, well, that was boring for everybody, including myself, right? And so I'm working on getting better at that every day as well. But yeah, that's one reason that in our training process, we are so careful to pair, you know, 3 hours of lecture or content exposure or sharing from a curator, from a researcher, from someone who's an expert in that field, and who can not only give us, you know, important basic knowledge of whatever we're going to talk about, but also find those amazing little stories that might not be embodied in the label copy, and that are hard for us to figure out for ourselves, that we can kind of hold in our pockets, and then pair the other half of that with, okay, now what do we do with that so that we aren't just lecturing, so that we aren't just info dumping? How do we then apply this content? And it's hard. I mean, this is something that we practice at for decades and decades and can always learn and grow with. And I couldn't agree more in that sense.
I want to say at the Reagan is that we've worked so hard on that specific matter. We've had so many discussions with the committees about how do we make this program come alive? How do we teach this and then be able to tell this wonderful story? One of the things that's helped us during training and what we've changed during training is not only do we have the classroom training, and we have the classroom training, but before those trainees leave the class and go on their shifts, they're practicing, they're presenting. We have a day where they'll present a 1-minute presentation in the Oval Office. They're just getting the feel. What does it feel like to present this information? And that's helped a lot with our trainees going on the floor and making this information come alive.
I think part of it too is the connecting to visitors or students' lives. Like, how do you bridge that connection? So you've got this great information and it's a really interesting story, but you still have to connect with the student. Otherwise, they might not feel that same passion, even though you're really passionate too. And I think that's what we're kind of talking about. How do you tease that out? How do you make those connections?
Because if I could just tell everyone in my whole life, like, no, trust me, this is really cool, and then they would believe me, I mean, the whole world would be better, first of all. But I mean, unfortunately, it's not that simple, right? It's harder than that.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm right here. So I'm going to take just 2 more questions. I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. So there's a question on this side and a question here, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for sharing. I want to jump back to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and I'm hoping that you guys can maybe talk a little bit more about the types of professional training that you offer your staff and your volunteers, or if there are any existing partnerships with communities to help diversify your docent pools or to have those conversations. And I have a follow-up question: if some of those practices are being put into place, do you have any structures to keep staff and volunteers accountable for that work?
I'll try and keep it quick. Yes. So some of this has to do with what I was speaking to before about really thinking about a structure that provides a home and an opportunity for all kinds of members of the community who have different types of needs, and kind of providing a place where they can find fulfillment in those needs within our program. And that's one piece of that. Another very important piece is some of the, just important training and exposure around issues that we might not as individuals perhaps be dealing with on a day-to-day. So our institution is really just moving into that area in about the last year and a half. So some of that focus has been, for example, we've partnered, we're a county department, actually, the Natural History Museum. And so we've partnered with the county to offer implicit bias training for all of our staff and volunteers, and really just the first steps in thinking about what are the biases that we carry with us and how do they affect our work and our relationships, and hoping and kind of working to continue that forward. We've recently offered some trainings around kind of generational trends and needs, and how we can both address those for ourselves, with our colleagues, as well as with our visitors, kind of thinking about that. We have some plans to be working with some folks who have some experience in helping us to work with communities that have experienced trauma and what that might look like. Some outreach to some groups who can work with us around our audiences who are on the autism spectrum. So there's a variety of different of these types of trainings. We're partnering with our HR department, our human resources department, to try and open up, any training that's being offered for staff to also be offered for volunteers where possible, and trying to kind of really live that. But again, as much as it is important to be offering those training experiences for folks, it is all equally important to then be unpacking that and talking about okay, so now that we've learned a whole bunch, what does that mean? How do we apply that in our work as we kind of move forward? And I'll just briefly state that we have a community engagement council for the museum as a whole that is currently trying to tackle our outreach into the community and strengthen our relationships with the LA community as a whole and all of the communities that live within Los Angeles. And part of that is included in the volunteer program, but we're kind of one piece of that overall effort.
You know, there's one program I'd love to talk about that we do at Reagan, and it began with one of the gentlemen who works on security detail with us, who has since moved on. It's called a mentor program, and we work with students who are in the juvenile system or who have been in trouble. There's about 15 of us who have been professionally, trained very well with working with these kids who have been in trouble and they no longer live at home, or they live in facilities, or they're in foster care. And there is nothing like mentoring these kids and talking about President Reagan's story. Here you have a president that had a very tough upbringing. You know what? A lot of these kids had a tough upbringing too, and look what you can do. So it's a wonderful program.
I am so sorry, but we're now, we need to wrap up. So thank you so much for visiting us and for all of your expertise and knowledge that you've shared with us. Thank you for everyone for attending, and we will see you all in November for our next general meeting.